So let's talk a little about arrays. Before we get into it, let's just talk briefly and give you some generic descriptions of what an array is. An array is a special kind of variable that is able to hold multiple values. So all of the variables that we've done up until now has had one value. We've always done, temperature equals, and then we've given it one value, or name equals, or principal amount, for the ones we all did last week, equal to 1. But with an array, you're able to basically save multiple variables underneath one variable name, and that variable name is what we call an array. Now, each of the things inside of a variable, so all the multiple variables inside of an array, we call elements in the array, and each element is addressable by what's called an index. And I guess to make that point, let's go ahead and just create an array. Now, arrays can be created in multiple ways. The simplest way to create an array is very similar to how we've always been declaring variables, and that is we say var, and we give it a name, and then we give it assignment operator of equals, and then the main difference is we start with these square braces here. So the square brackets, and inside the square brackets we put a comma separated list of the multiple values that we want to save in here. So in this first instance here, you'll see that we're saving integers in here, and I've got just a bunch of random integers in there. This second list here, which is commented out, you'll notice, and I'm commenting them out because you'll see that we have the same name here, and we're going to use them inside this code. And so I give them the same name so that we don't have to have separate code to handle these. I want to show you the difference between, or basically show you these two different types. We've got this array, which contains string values, and this array which contains numbers. The main point here I want to make is that our arrays can contain any of the types of variables that we've dealt with up to this point. You could have booleans in there if you really wanted. You could have the integers, you could have your float values, you could have obviously the strings, and this is how they're declared. One of the other ways to declare them is you could say var sample array equals new array, and then you pass in the size, and that allocates enough space in memory for that array to be able to hold the values that I have in there, and then you could assign the values later. So and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But here we have it. We've got an array called sample array that we have declared, and we've passed in 6 different values into this one. And let's go ahead and just talk a little bit about the index, how we reference the different things in there. Now, it's important to note that an array, the indexes of an array in JavaScript always start at 0. So the address of each of these spots is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So a 6-element array has an index of 0 through 5. Now let's write a little bit of code to display this array programmatically, and in doing so we can talk a little bit about looping through an array, and as we loop through the array we can talk a little bit about how we reference each element in the array. So we basically want to write an array that loops, or excuse me, we want to write a loop that goes through each element of the array and spits it out to the screen in a certain way. So we'll do that with a for loop. So you guys know a for loop. Do the I equals 0 because we've talked about the index. Now the I is what we're going to use to iterate through the index of each of these. So our I equals 0 is going to start with index 0, and we are going to go until, I is less than, and there's a little trick, sample array dot length, if I can spell length. Now all arrays have a function built into them that is the length. So if you were to run this, this is going to spit out the length of the array, and as we know here the array is going to be 6. So we're basically saying I equals 0 to I is less than 6, and then we're just going to increment I one at a time. And then we're just going to come in here and we're going to use our trusty old document.write that we've talked about in the past, and I'm just going to copy in some code and we'll talk about it. And our document.write is going to come in here and it's going to say it's going to add some string concatenation in here. The index I, which is going to be 0 through 6, contains the sample array index I. So inside the square brackets, when you want to reference a very specific element inside an array, you basically give the name and then you give the index inside of square brackets. So if I were to say sample array in 0 in here, it would spit out the first element, and if I were to say number 5, it would spit out the last element. So as you can see here, that it's already spit out the results over here. We've written some code here that basically says index 0 contains 2, right? Index 1 contains 34, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and just add these in there just so we can reference the fact that these are the elements inside there. Now if we were to go ahead and comment out this one and let the string array come in there, same information is going to come through. Basically going to go through index 0 is Zach, index 3 is Amanda. And we reference that out here, and we could do this manually if we want to say document write line. If I just wanted to say sample array 2, then you'll notice we get Chris, because we have 0, 1, 2. If I were to say 0, then it would reference Zach. So that's how we can address or pull out individual elements from an array when we need them. And we'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about arrays in the next video. And well, before we do that, I wanted to kind of introduce one last loop to you guys. I know I promised this to you in previous weeks, and it's time to talk about it now. When we talked about loops many weeks ago, there was one loop that was in the text that had a little note next to it that said we will talk about this later when we talk about arrays. And so let's go ahead and talk about this. And that is the for each loop. And the for each loop is really cool because it basically will allow you to put in any object that has multiple things in it, an array being a good example, and it'll just iterate through it, and it is smart enough to know how big the array is, and it's smart enough to just loop through as many times as it needs to go through all of the elements inside that array. And you can do that by simply saying for, and then we give a variable. So this could be I, or this could be X, or anything you wanted in there. We could call this well, let's just call it X for now. But it's basically this is our variable that's similar to I, that's going to contain the index of the thing that we've passed in. And then we say in sample array. So this is basically saying for every element inside sample array, and X is going to be used to hold the index of the current thing that's being looped through. So then it's just a matter of we coming in here and we can copy in the exact same code. Of course, we're going to have to change I to X because X is going to contain the index, and then the index reference here is going to have to be X also. And then you'll notice we get the exact same over here. And now we can get rid of this one here, and we have the exact same through in a special kind of a for loop, the for each loop, which allows you to iterate through arrays really cleanly without having to add in the dot length command, or it's just a real simple clean for loop that's smart enough to iterate through the array in the exact number of times that the array has elements in it. So there's that. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about what you can do with arrays, and then we'll probably finish up with one last video that ties it all together with talking a little bit about taking the average temperature using an array as input. So, all right.